December 7th, 2018. Detroit, Michigan. Once a powerhouse of American industry, the Motor City is struggling to reinvent itself.
Detroit's a great town, but it's a gritty town. And we've experienced some very serious housing and economic crises. So it's really been trying to bounce back from all of that.
Detroit is making a comeback. Our city is on the up and coming.
But every reinvention has setbacks. Early that Friday morning, Detroit 911 receives an urgent call from the vicinity of Palmer Park.
Palmer Park is a historical park in the city of Detroit, located in the University District.
The Palmer Park area in the night can be a little bit of a sketchy place.
This woman needs help.
The caller says there was a woman lying in the street.
I think she's hurt. Let's get somebody out here.
It was approximately 5:55 in the morning.
Police are on the scene within minutes.
My victim was laying on the ground, face up, on the corner. She was grasping what appeared to be a metal spike or like a piece of scissors.
And she's bleeding from what appears to be a single gunshot wound.
It was her left side right here, like in the armpit area.
She's gone.
The individual was deceased on scene.
According to the ID the police find in the purse, the dead woman's name is Kelly Stowe.
"36-year-old Kelly Stowe always had a strong sense of self.
Kelly was a force to be reckoned with.
She had her own thoughts, her own mind, but she was very special.
Not only was she beautiful and poised, but she was also generous, kind, loving, supportive. The community loved her.
But it had taken determination to get there.
Kelly wasn't born a woman.
He was born Tristan. He was a grandma's baby, the light of everybody's life, spoiled rotten.
We're a small family, but we love strong, and we're there, for each other, because we realize that we're all we have.
And even from a young age, everyone realized that Tristan was different.
The earliest I remember, I know like at 7, she would come home and, be crying, kids teasing her. I didn't really realize how much it affected me, but it was like, no, it's nothing wrong with you. God don't make no mistakes.
Throughout high school, Tristan struggled to fit in.
She got into sports. She started off with track. She did pretty good. Then she got into football, and me and her dad made her stay with football. She hated it. We found out years later she hated football, but she stayed with it.
She was well known for her athleticism.
She got a partial scholarship to college and everything.
But her heart was never truly in it.
It was rough in college. She ended up doing 2 years and then decided to come home.
And when she came home, she finally started to embrace her true self.
We talked about careers, what you want to do. So she was always in fashion and makeup and things of that nature. So we found the International Institute for Design and Technology. She enrolled there. It was like, oh gosh, she finally found a school where she felt like she fit in. Thank God. From there, she just flourished.
That's where she really found herself.
It was then that Tristan became Kelly.
She was like, Mother, when I'm a woman, I feel empowered. I feel strong. I feel beautiful. And it was like, wow. I respect and love her for the fact that she accepted her truth.
Nobody should hold nothing in if it's detrimental. Just be happy and live,
But it was when Kelly discovered the world of ballroom that she really found a home.
The ballroom scene started in New York, where the Black and Latino community decided to come together and put on their own pageants and their own celebrations of who they are and their identities, and created a space that was just for them.
When we were watching TV and saw people at BET Awards and walking on the red carpets, in our minds, we knew that we won't be able to do that. So we created our own space where we awarded ourselves and gave ourselves praise. So that's why it's important. It's ours.
When it came to the ballroom scene, Kelly came alive. People could recognize her from a mile away. 6'4" stature, beautiful, confident.
She was a winner. When she stepped on the floor, she won. And if she didn't win, like, you knew she was there.
But Kelly was more than just a fierce competitor.
Girl, try this one on too. Stop playing.
She was also a role model.
I didn't know how to do hair and makeup when I was younger, so of course she taught me. This is a good braid of hair. What kind of braid is this, honey?
She did my hair. She dressed me.
She gave me the motivation. She let me know that I could do it.
She was my rock. She was my big sister, but she also was my mentor.
But now, the special woman who commanded the ballroom floor lies dead on a Detroit street corner.
She succumbed to a gunshot wound. Other than her personal effects, there was one spent shell casing.
And while Kelly died clutching half of a pair of scissors in her hand, there is no sign of a gun.
It's definitely a homicide.
But could it be more than that?
We've got one female deceased. Can you go ahead and start major crimes in the ME?
A transgender woman had been murdered.
It is so dangerous for them just to be who they are.
Was this a hate crime?
After leaving her old life behind, Kelly Stowe had gone on to shine in the world of ballroom.
She loved it. That seemed to bring her a lot of joy.
It is the best thing in the world when you are finally able to be your authentic self.
So we have these good hoochie mama dresses. She was bold, beautiful, and funny, and intelligent. She was warm, and everyone loved her because she always had a loving smile on her face. She was a big personality.
And she was a role model to those around her.
When people are not afraid to be their authentic selves and be out there, that starts to break down barriers.
She felt comfortable living her own life and her own truth.
But now Kelly's life has come to a sudden, violent end.
She is dead on a Detroit street corner, killed by a single gunshot wound.
So investigators really needed to know if Kelly was the target of a hate crime.
A hate crime is anytime you intentionally assault somebody just because of their sexual orientation, their social status, their religion, their ethnicity.
A lot of people take for granted the little things that are really unsafe for my community. It's not safe for every trans person to take the bus or go to the gas station to get a pack of cigarettes. The daily things that we take for granted are some of the reasons as to why my sisters die on a daily basis.
Living this lifestyle, we have lost a lot of people, and it puts you in a scary place.
It's being normalized, killing trans women.
For the moment, the detectives aren't sure what motivated the murder, or if Kelly was even shot on the street corner.
This could have been someone that's dumped out of a vehicle. This could have been an old spent shell casing.
However, since the victim is trans, the detectives have to take that into account.
At the onset of any investigation, you have to follow the evidence, right?
And based on where they found Kelly, The detectives have reason to believe the crime could be motivated by anti-trans prejudice.
Trans women of color, particularly, congregate in the 6 Mile and Woodward area, which is Palmer Park area in Detroit. It's been like that for quite a while. There is an LGBT center there.
It's the only place in the city that will take them in. No homeless shelter will take in a trans person in the city because most of them are faith-based. So there's just no support system for this community.
To survive, many turn to sex work.
When I was younger, I was doing sex work, survival sex work. I didn't like it. I don't like it. It's very dark, creepy, scary. If you're there, know that you feel in your mind there's no other choice.
Nobody in their right mind wakes up and says, this is what I want to do for a living. They don't have any other option to have the things that they need in order to survive, whatever that is, whether that's food, whether that's access to hormones, medication, a roof over their head, a phone to be able to call their loved ones.
The detectives suspect sex work could explain why they found Kelly's body near Palmer Park.
It has been historically a place where you find prostitution.
If someone is looking for a target, if they're looking to murder a transgender woman, the Palmer Park area would be the perfect place to do that.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that her death was a result of a hate crime.
Hoping for insight, detectives start knocking on doors around the park.
They're looking for more witnesses, right? People who were in maybe the park area, but it seems like nobody saw anything.
A lot of times, the community doesn't want to step forward. A lot of times, it's mistrust of the police. They don't want to be targeted themselves or retaliated against. We can do what we can, but they still have to live in that community at the end of the day.
However, the canvas does produce one thing that could be useful.
There was a church across the street that had video.
But before the detectives can get a copy of the video, 911 dispatch gets another urgent call.
The call came in about 6:30 in the morning.
I'd like to report a shooting.
It's coming from a gentleman who says that he experienced a robbery in the area earlier that morning.
They got in my car. They wouldn't get out. Give me money, get out.
He said that he had to shoot them.
Detectives investigating the shooting that killed Kelly Stowe have just been informed that dispatch received a 911 call from a man who says he may be responsible.
He said that he was driving early morning on his way to work and got flagged down by someone right outside of Palmer Park.
It looks like she was in distress. I slowed down to see if she needed any help.
The caller, 46-year-old Albert Weathers, says he'd stopped to see if she needed assistance.
We learned that he was a pastor of a church in Sterling Heights.
He does also say that he was a form of law enforcement because he was an armed guard at the water authority. So he had a little bit of training.
You okay, man? Oh, God,
He said that he was surprised when she had a low voice, like a man.
But he says it's what happened next that really took him by surprise.
Give me your money. The woman attempted to get in the car and rob him.
She pulled something out of her purse. It looked like a knife. Give me your money, get out!
He says that he'd instinctively gone for his gun.
In addition to being a security guard, he has a concealed carry permit.
Out, now! It just happened so fast.
He said that he was aware that the gun went off. He didn't know if he had shot the person.
I wasn't even aiming at her.
He said she fell back out of the car, he yanked the door closed, and then drove off.
This scared me to death.
He said it wasn't until he calmed down and started thinking straight that he called 911.
When the detectives return to the precinct to reach out to Albert, he agrees to come in and give them a statement.
He wasn't too hesitant about telling his story.
Thank you.
While they wait for him to arrive, word of Kelly's death spreads through Detroit's tight-knit trans community.
In our community, news travels fast. Like, I found out immediately.
When I got that call, I was devastated. I was in shock because I literally talked to her a couple days before.
The news also reaches Kelly's family.
A friend of hers had called, and she said, well, on the news, they had this story that a trans woman was killed, and I think it was Kelly.
I guess everything just kind of went blank for a little while because I couldn't just get that together. You know, she's dead.
I was just like, this can't be happening. Not one of mine. You know, that happens to other people.
While Kelly's family reels from the news of her death, Albert arrives at the station to give his formal statement.
He appeared to be very forthcoming.
I'm just, still shaken up by the situation.
Yes, sir.
He starts the interview by telling the detective what happened that morning.
He told us that he was on the way to work and realized that he didn't have enough gas.
I needed, to stop at the gas station.
He went to a gas station that he was familiar with in the area and comes to the intersection of Brush and 6 Mile. That's when an individual on the corner waved their hands like this, as if they were in distress and needed help.
And so as I raised the window down, that individual unlocked my door and proceeded to get in my vehicle.
When asked what happened next, he said this individual immediately requested money from him.
And that's when this individual that appeared to be female, but when they spoke, was a male voice.
I'm trying to help you.
He stated he refused to give money and requested that she exit his vehicle.
And from what he said, she wouldn't get out.
Albert says that's when Kelly had pulled something from her bag.
Something metal. It was metal.
He cross-drew his firearm, instructed Kelly to exit his vehicle again.
You gonna pull a gun? And actually, instead of being scared by the pistol, the woman actually just started yelling.
And then they kind of was coming toward me. That's when the gun went off.
He stated that she collapsed to the ground and he closed his door.
He drove away and went to work.
You called the police when you got to your job?
Not when I got there, no.
He explained that he was all riled up and needed to calm down before he called the police.
He spoke articulate. He was to the point. He dialed in on his conversation when he spoke to you to make sure you understood.
He was portraying himself as a good Samaritan when he was met with not only a hostile person, but with the threat of being robbed.
But the detective can't help but wonder if Albert is telling the whole story.
So he just happens to stop and help a transgender woman in an area that's known for prostitution?
People going to this area, they know what they're looking for.
After taking Albert's statement, the detectives do a little digging into the alleged Good Samaritan.
He has no record, everything is clean.
He was a family man. He was an upstanding citizen, a husband, a father, all the things that you think a pastor should be.
And they were able to find the conceal and carry license that he claimed to have.
The detectives also look into Kelly's criminal history.
Kelly didn't have much of a record either.
There's certainly nothing to suggest that she would have attempted robbery.
What's the story here? There's definitely more to it.
Hoping to find out, the detective's next move is to follow up with the man who made the original 911 call.
He didn't see the actual shooting or heard the shooting, but he saw a man push a woman out of a car.
And as it turns out, that's not all he saw.
And some man got off the driver's side, snatched the phone out of her hand.
Detroit detectives investigating the shooting that killed Kelly Stowe are following up with the witness who first called 911.
And he tells police he's just been passing through the area on his way to work that morning.
I got the music go up there, and all of a sudden, it would come out with somebody getting thrown out there.
He didn't hear any gunshots, and he also didn't see any arguing.
The car said stopped, and I realized I saw the door open, the woman get thrown out.
He could tell that the woman had a phone in her hand. He could see the light from the screen.
Then the witness says he saw a man get out of the driver's side of the car and cross to the woman on the pavement.
They snatched the phone out of her hand, and they got back in the car.
They then leave heading towards 75 area, which would be east of that location.
You said you saw him walk around the curb? Where?
After the man drove away, he saw the woman on the street, and it was clear that she was in pain.
He says he then drove slowly past the woman to check on her.
I could tell they were moving, like wincing. So that's told me to call the emergency police, get somebody over there.
Yeah, there's a woman that needs help.
But he had no idea she'd been shot.
Did you hear any gunfire?
No weapons. Like I said, I couldn't tell since she was moving, so I didn't see anything done to her.
Did you see him assault her or assault him at all? Any kind?
Just nobody else in the vehicle. None that I can tell. I just know from the passenger side, she was thrown from the car.
Parts of what the witness says fits with what Albert has already told detectives.
He said that he shot her, and he kind of just let her drop out the car.
But the witness also saw things Albert hadn't mentioned.
Albert never said anything about Kelly having a phone.
So now we have two stories happening.
There may be a way for detectives to uncover the truth.
During initial canvass, detectives noted that there was a church nearby that had cameras that covered the area where the incident had occurred.
I had one of our video people extract the video from the church.
The video is grainy, but it does show Albert's car pulling into frame.
It was dark, but you could clearly see that the car stops, and you can see the dome light coming on in the car, and you can see there's some sort of communication going on in the vehicle because it's just sitting there.
Then a moment later, a man does get out of the driver's side.
It's a very grainy video, but you do see that he then approaches the passenger side. You see a muzzle flash.
Could that be the supposed phone light that the witness saw?
Kelly's essentially dumped out of the car, left in the street, and he goes back around, gets into the driver's side, and pulls off.
However, while the video doesn't quite match the eyewitness statement, it doesn't confirm Albert's account either.
Mr. Weather stated that a woman flagged him down as if she needed help at that corner.
But in the video, Kelly was already in the car when Albert pulled up to the corner.
Which makes me believe that he picked her up at a different location.
The video also provides a possible clue about where Albert picked up Kelly.
The video was very grainy. It was dark, but you could most certainly see the car actually came from a street that ran perpendicular to 6 Mile.
They're coming from the direction of the nearby LGBT center.
A lot of trans people go there that experience homelessness, that need non-perishable items, a food box, and different resources.
Detectives suspect someone at the shelter could know more about Kelly's death, if they're willing to talk.
The trans community, for good reason, has in the past not really trusted law enforcement.
Sometimes they're sex workers. They don't want to deal with the police.
Right this way.
But this time, the detectives are approached by someone from the trans community who is more than willing to talk.
They really had decided that they had had enough.
I came forward out of rage. I just was thinking about my friend.
She is a survival sex worker, and she knows Kelly.
And she also knows Albert.
You want to go for a ride?
I just knew, like, this is the person that did it. This is the person who killed my friend.
She said it wasn't a robbery. This was on purpose.
Detectives investigating the shooting that killed Kelly Stowe have just been approached by a woman named Bridget who says she knows Albert Weathers, the man who admitted to shooting Kelly in self-defense.
He picked me up from time to time.
I was really scared for my life, but I also knew that somebody had to speak up.
She has known Mr. Weathers for a long time.
Yeah.
I had known him before I even hit the age of 20, and I'm 35 now.
And Bridget says Albert is no stranger to the women that work that area of Detroit.
He comes to the Palmer Park area and picks up prostitutes.
Albert was a client?
Not for a while, but yeah.
Why not for a while?
It just wasn't worth it.
My experience with him was negative.
There was always a conflict at the end of any of the sex work.
Whatever they agreed to, we wanted to change the price of the services.
I walked away a lot of times from him with no money.
She also tells police that Albert's behavior is aggressive.
It's like we was living a double life. I never would have thought he was a pastor. I never would have thought he had a family and a wife. He was very manipulative and verbally abusive. Like, he was a monster.
So you saw Albert pick up Kelly before?
Yeah.
She had been on dates with him. I won't be able to say how many, but I knew that she was familiar with him.
That just changed everything and completely blew his story out of the water.
Well, we'll be in touch.
All right, I'll see you out.
After talking to Bridget, the detectives turn back to Albert.
He sticks to his story at first.
I already told you, I saw her on the corner.
What if I told you that we had evidence that you're lying?
What evidence?
I explained we have video. The video was grainy, but it showed that no one was walking in that area at that corner.
Okay. I picked her up. We had an argument, but I didn't mean to kill her.
He said he pulled the trigger by mistake.
I just wanted her out of my car.
Why don't you just call 911?
I was scared.
Scared of what?
He's a pastor, and he didn't know how this was going to be perceived, that he was picking up a trans woman for sex.
As long as we continue to villainize trans women, we're going to continue to be murdered. We're going to continue to have higher rates of domestic violence because of the social stigma. The reality is a lot of them rather love us in private and kill us in public than have anybody know of their association with us.
But while social pressures and prejudice created the circumstances that led to Kelly's death, it was Albert who pulled the trigger.
I think that it had more so to do with
Get out. Where's the rest of it?
Mr. Weathers not willing to pay for some service.
Where's the rest of my money at? Stop playing with me.
I asked you to get out.
I'm not going nowhere. You're going to give me the rest of my money that you owe me. You got the right one today.
I'm not gonna say it was premeditated, but I just felt like he already was ready for that type of situation.
I don't know what you walking over here for. I'm not going nowhere. You're gonna give me the rest of my money. Out.
He pulled the trigger and shot her one time. And then he just left and went to work, like a normal day.
The way that he left her in the street and drove away, it's sickening.
I don't think he saw us as people. I think he saw us as a lot of people do, a fetish.
It became pretty clear that he wasn't the upstanding pastor and father and husband that he had claimed to be.
Miss Albert, stand up.
After the interview, the detectives charge Albert with the murder of Kelly Stowe.
I was like, thank God. I don't have to go through life wondering who did this and why.
I was relieved, but I was more relieved that he wouldn't hurt nobody else, so to speak, because there's a lot of young trans ladies down there.
I was excited, but I also was anxious to know what was the next step.
The prosecutors were just as anxious.
At the time, I was a prosecutor in Wayne County and working in the homicide division. So Prosecutor Worthy and Dana Nessel, who is now our Attorney General, put together the Fair Michigan Justice Project. They asked if I would come in to prosecute, to start tackling the violence in that 6 Mile Woodward area against the trans community.
It has changed astronomically my community's view on law enforcement, interacting with law enforcement.
Our trans community, I think, is feeling a little more comfortable coming forward.
But then, just 6 months after the arrest, there's a development in the case that could undo all that progress.
Albert Weathers was granted a bond hearing.
When you're charged with murder, typically you are not granted bond.
But the judge in this instance sets Albert's bond at $100,000.
Only 10% has to be paid. So with $10,000, Albert's a free man.
I was angry. I was furious, to be honest. They literally just let a murderer go.
"46-year-old Albert Weathers has been released on bond after his arrest for the murder of Kelly Stowe."
During that hearing, the judge repeatedly asked the prosecutor what would be the harm in allowing him to be back on the streets until trial.
But the judge says Albert is a pastor, doesn't have any priors, and is not considered a flight risk.
Kelly was a victim in this case, and the defendant threw her out like she was trash and drove away and left her to die.
The prosecutor goes on to try to remind the judge that he waited an hour to figure out what story he was going to come up with to tell the police. The judge then says he understands all of that. But how is that a threat to other people?
I was pretty upset about it because the judge, in this case, stated on the record that they did not believe him to be a danger to the general community. So this was another instance of danger to the trans community not registering.
We were just all looking like, huh? Like another slap to the face, another like, y'all don't matter.
I was just angry. Oh my God, why he need to be out on bond? He may go and mess with somebody else.
This is not the first person that he got physical with, and I just feel like he's gonna do it again.
I'm next, is what I thought. Because I was the only person who came forward to identify him.
After making bond, Albert returns to his job as a security guard and to his church.
He even officiated at a wedding.
It was crazy. It was more like manipulation.
I wanted to go to his church. I wanted to rally like a group of people together just to go to his church on one good Sunday right? Because I wanted to know if his congregation really knew who was sitting behind that pulpit.
Albert spends the next 4 years out on bond awaiting trial.
With the COVID, the pandemic, everything got pushed back and pushed back and pushed back.
It really had everyone asking, is he ever going to be on trial?
I had to just say, okay, God, revenge is yours, because it's going to come to an end eventually.
Finally, in 2023, Albert's attorneys reached out to the prosecutors about a possible plea deal.
I feel that we had a good chance of, obviously, a conviction. And defendants, when they see an onslaught of evidence, they make decisions based on that.
I think we all know that Albert Weathers had a history of soliciting transgender prostitutes. He was already facing pretty serious allegations, and I don't think he wanted all of that out in the open.
The prosecution also worries that a jury might believe Albert's claims of self-defense.
It's the gay panic defense that they want everyone to buy into. It's always the gay panic defense.
A lot of it comes down to what you can prove. You don't know what a jury's gonna do.
It's possible he wouldn't serve any prison time at all.
In July of 2023, Albert pleads guilty to second-degree murder and a felony firearm charge.
The felony firearm is an additional charge that goes with the commission of a crime while using a firearm.
In exchange for his plea, the judge sentences Albert to 8 years for murder, with an additional 2 years for the firearm charge.
I was not surprised with the plea. He knew he was guilty. We knew he was guilty. They knew he was guilty. The judge knew, but that's not a sentence.
Of course, you know, you hear murder, you want 20, 25 years, but the prosecutor, she was very good in explaining how that system worked. So once she broke it down and when it came back to what they said, I was okay with that.
For murder, too, for someone who has no prior criminal history, these numbers are actually within the realm of what they could get after a trial.
Everyone would have liked to see him serve more time, but I also think after so long, I think everyone was glad to see that justice was being served in some way.
I'm glad that finally this was an end and he admitted guilt.
The family does have a little bit of closure that Mr. Weathers is sitting down in prison, and hopefully he will understand why he's there.
And while that hardly makes up for the loss of Kelly's life, those that loved her are dedicated to ensuring that others don't suffer the same fate.
I didn't get a chance to save my friend. Like, I'm an advocate in the community now.
What happened to Kelly and what has happened to so many other transgender women of color who find themselves in survival sex work is that they couldn't find work elsewhere. So the lesson for all of us is to just tear down these barriers.
Allies, let's create businesses, let's create opportunities. If we all sit at a table, right, we can build.
It's a fitting tribute to the woman who meant so much to so many.
She touched lives, her dignity, and her desire just to help others in her community.
I mean, you don't look good whatever you wear.
Will continue to live on.
Remember the name Kelly Stowe, and know that she was an inspiration to people.
The night in Los Angeles on August 8, 1969, did not announce itself as anything unusual. It was the kind of warm California evening that seemed almost rehearsed for perfection, as if the city had learned to dress itself in softness for the cameras that were always watching somewhere in the distance. The air carried the faint sweetness of dry summer plants mixing with the exhaust of cars still moving along Mulholland Drive and Cielo Drive. In the hills above Beverly Hills, where the homes were spaced like secrets rather than neighbors, the world felt insulated, detached, almost unreal. Inside one of those homes, high above the city lights, a young actress was preparing for motherhood. Her name was Sharon Tate. She was 26 years old, 8 months pregnant, and living in a house that seemed to belong more to a dream than to reality. She moved through the room slowly that night, her presence soft against the polished floors and wide windows that opened toward the dark silhouette of the canyon. There was a calmness in the house, the kind that comes from expectation rather than peace. Clothes were folded, laughter had recently lingered in the air, and there was still the trace of dinner shared among friends, who had decided to stay a little longer, as friends often do when no one is in a hurry to leave life behind. But outside, beyond the gates and hedges, something else was already in motion. It did not arrive like a storm. It did not break the night with warning. It came instead with human footsteps, deliberate and quiet, carrying with them a kind of certainty that did not belong in that place. 4 figures moved up the long driveway. They did not speak loudly. They did not hurry. They were not strangers to silence. Each step they took seemed to belong to a different version of themselves than the ones they might have been in another life. One of them paused briefly near the edge of the property, looking up at the house as if measuring its reality. Another adjusted something at their side, an object that would later become part of a story too disturbing to fully belong to memory. At the center of it all was a young man named Charles Tex Watson, though the name itself would soon feel less like identity and more like instruction. He had been told, not in the way children are told bedtime stories, but in the way belief is carved into vulnerable minds, that this place was part of something larger. Something symbolic. Something necessary. Behind him, the others followed with the obedience of people who had surrendered the right to question direction. Inside the house, the night continued unaware. There were voices in the living room earlier, laughter that softened into conversation, the clinking of glasses, the casual intimacy of people who believed the world was still predictable. Sharon Tate had once been part of a film industry that turned faces into light, but tonight she was simply a woman waiting for the arrival of her child. The house belonged to a temporary gathering of lives intersecting briefly, before separating again in the morning. No one heard the gate. No one saw the figures cross the lawn. When the first sound finally came, it was not dramatic. It was small. A disruption in the language of the night that did not immediately register as danger. A door opening where it should not have opened. A voice that did not belong to the house. Confusion first, then recognition too late for it to matter. What followed would later be described in courtrooms and newspapers, reduced to sentences that struggled to contain what had occurred. But in that moment, it was not a story. It was presence. It was terror made physical. Inside the house, time fractured. Rooms that had held warmth minutes earlier became spaces of disorientation. The people inside were pulled from the ordinary rhythm of their evening into something that refused to follow logic. There was pleading. There was shock that could not fully form into words. There were attempts to understand what was happening, as if understanding could still alter the outcome. Sharon Tate, carrying life within her, became one of the central points around which this violence revolved. Those who later reconstructed the night would struggle with the image of her final hours, not because of spectacle alone, but because of contrast, the expectation of new life against the sudden arrival of irreversible destruction. Outside the house, the canyon remained unchanged. The wind still moved through the trees in slow, indifferent patterns. The city below continued to glow as if nothing had shifted. Los Angeles, in its vastness, did not pause for the small eruption occurring in one of its hidden homes. And yet, inside, everything had already ended in the way that endings sometimes arrive, before the final moment is even reached. The figures who entered did not behave like traditional intruders seeking gain or escape. There was something ritualistic in their movement, something that suggested they were not fully anchored in their own actions. Commands, spoken earlier elsewhere, echoed invisibly through their decisions. Ideas planted long before this night had taken root in places where doubt had been slowly removed. In the aftermath, investigators would struggle with this aspect more than any physical evidence. The question was not only what happened, but how people could be led to believe that such a thing had meaning. Inside the house, the violence unfolded in a sequence that felt disconnected from time itself. Moments stretched and collapsed. Sounds overlapped with silence. The boundary between perpetrator and environment blurred, as if the house itself had become a witness that could not look away. When it was over, the silence that returned did not resemble peace. It was heavier, more permanent, as if the house had absorbed something it could not release. The figures left the way they had come, disappearing into the night without ceremony. The gates closed behind them. The driveway returned to emptiness. From a distance, nothing about the property suggested transformation. The windows still reflected faint light. The hills still held their shape against the sky. But inside, 5 lives had been extinguished in a manner that would soon become impossible for the city to ignore. It would take hours before anyone fully understood what had occurred in that house. Even longer before the name of Sharon Tate would be spoken alongside the words that would define her final night. And longer still before the pattern would be recognized, connecting this location to another house not far away, and to a group of individuals whose existence would come to symbolize something far larger than the crimes themselves. At the center of it all, unseen during the act itself, was an idea. Not a weapon, not a person, but a belief that had been carefully shaped and passed from voice to voice until it no longer resembled its origin. A belief that the world was approaching collapse. That chaos was inevitable. That destruction was not only expected but required. And in the quiet aftermath of Cielo Drive, as the first hint of morning began to lighten the edge of the sky, Los Angeles remained unaware that it had already crossed into a story it would never fully escape. The house stood still. The hills remained silent. And somewhere in the distance, the city continued to sleep, holding within it the first shadow of something that would soon spread far beyond a single night, a single home, or a single group of people who had once called themselves a family. Los Angeles in the late 1960s was a city that no longer knew what version of itself it wanted to be. On the surface, it still carried the polished image of American ambition. The film studios continued to produce dreams in Technicolor, the palm-lined streets still promised wealth and escape, and the ocean still arrived every morning with the same indifferent rhythm it had always known. But beneath that surface, something restless was growing. The city was splitting into layers that no longer aligned with each other. One layer belonged to television premieres and gated homes in the hills. Another belonged to crowded apartments filled with young people trying to reject everything their parents had built. And between those layers, something unstable was forming, something that did not yet have a name, but would soon be recognized through its consequences. It was an era defined by contradiction. The Vietnam War was on every screen, every newspaper, every whispered argument between strangers in cafes. Young men were being drafted into a conflict that many no longer understood. Universities were filled with protest signs and debates about freedom, identity, and authority. The idea of rejecting the system was no longer theoretical. It had become a daily act of survival for those who no longer trusted the institutions that shaped their lives. In California, especially, that rejection took on a softer, more spiritual shape. The counterculture movement was not only political but emotional. People left their homes searching for something they could not define. They traveled up and down the coast, slept on beaches, gathered in communes, experimented with music, drugs, and new interpretations of ancient philosophies. It was a generation trying to erase the instructions it had been given and replace them with something more authentic, even if they did not fully understand what authenticity meant. In that environment, vulnerability became a kind of currency. It was during this shifting landscape that a man named Charles Manson began to form something that would later be called a family, though it bore little resemblance to the word it used. He had spent much of his early life moving through institutions that were meant to correct behavior, but instead reinforced his understanding of control. Prisons, reform schools, and streets had taught him how to read people not as individuals, but as patterns of need. He learned quickly that some people were not looking for truth, but for direction. And direction, when spoken with enough certainty, could become indistinguishable from truth. By the late 1960s, Manson had arrived in California with little more than presence and language. He was not traditionally charismatic in a visible sense. There was nothing immediately impressive about his appearance. But he had a way of speaking that made uncertainty feel temporary. In conversations, he did not argue, he absorbed. He listened in a way that made others feel as if they were being understood more deeply than they understood themselves. And then, slowly, he began to reshape what they believed. The people who gathered around him were often young, disconnected, and searching for something that would replace the structures they had abandoned. Many had left stable homes. Some had fled abuse or neglect. Others were simply drifting, carried by the momentum of a culture that encouraged movement without destination. They were drawn not to Manson as a man of power, but as a man who seemed to offer clarity in a world that felt increasingly fragmented. They began to call themselves a family. The name suggested warmth, belonging, and protection. But within the group, those meanings were gradually replaced by something more rigid. The structure of the group was not built on equality, but on dependence. Manson positioned himself not as a leader in the traditional sense, but as an interpreter of reality. He spoke often in contradictions, blending spiritual references with fragments of popular culture, especially music. The Beatles, in particular, became central to his worldview, not as artists, but as symbolic messengers whose lyrics he believed contained hidden warnings about society's collapse. One phrase from their music, distorted and reinterpreted through his perspective, became something larger than its original form. In his interpretation, it was not just a song title or lyric structure, but a prophecy. He described a coming rupture in society, a collapse that would divide the world in ways that could not be reversed. In his version of events, chaos was not random, but inevitable, and those who understood it early would survive by stepping outside of conventional morality. Inside the group, these ideas did not spread like formal teachings. They spread through repetition, through shared living, through isolation from external correction. The group spent time in deserts, in houses, and eventually at a location known as Spahn Ranch, an abandoned movie set property on the outskirts of Los Angeles. The ranch, with its decaying structures and dust-covered remnants of old Western films, became a physical representation of their mental state. It was a place where time felt suspended, where the past and future seemed equally distant, and where the rules of society no longer applied in recognizable form. Life at the ranch was not structured in the way most communities are structured. Days blurred into each other. Sleep, food, conversation, and silence followed no consistent schedule. Manson moved among the group as both observer and central figure, shaping narratives, reinforcing beliefs, and gradually tightening the emotional boundaries that kept the group isolated from outside influence. Doubt was not confronted directly. It was dissolved through repetition and emotional dependency. Outside this enclosed world, Los Angeles continued to expand. Wealth and poverty existed side by side with increasing visibility. Hollywood parties continued in the hills, filled with actors, musicians, and industry figures who represented the public face of cultural success. At the same time, homelessness and counterculture migration filled other parts of the city with individuals who felt excluded from that success. The contrast between these worlds created a kind of tension that was not always visible, but was constantly present. The members of the group often moved between these layers of society, without fully belonging to either. They would appear in public spaces, sometimes interacting with musicians, sometimes taking temporary shelter in the homes of acquaintances, but always returning to the internal structure of the group, where meaning was defined internally rather than externally. The longer they remained within this system, the more difficult it became to distinguish personal thought from collective belief. What made this environment particularly unstable was not simply isolation, but reinterpretation. Events in the outside world were continuously reframed to fit the internal narrative. New stories about conflict or social unrest were presented not as unrelated occurrences, but as confirmation of the group's worldview. Fear and expectation became intertwined, reinforcing the belief that society itself was approaching a breaking point. Within this psychological structure, obedience did not feel like force. It felt like understanding. Instructions were not always given in explicit terms. Often they were implied, suggested through conversation, reinforced through group reaction, or shaped through emotional reward and withdrawal. In such an environment, the boundary between suggestion and command became increasingly difficult to identify. By the summer of 1969, this system had reached a level of internal stability that made it resistant to outside contradiction. Members no longer required constant persuasion. The framework of belief had become self-sustaining. Within it, Manson's interpretation of the world had replaced external reality as the primary reference point. It was in this context that Los Angeles unknowingly contained within it the conditions for what would soon unfold. The city, already fragmented in identity, held within its geography a series of intersecting lives that had no awareness of each other, but were moving toward the same point of collision. In the hills, where privacy created the illusion of separation from the city below, people continued to live in routines shaped by comfort and expectation. In other areas, individuals connected to the group moved through temporary spaces, carrying with them ideas that had been shaped far from those hills. The distance between these worlds was not only physical, but perceptual. Each existed without fully recognizing the reality of the other. And yet, beneath all of this, there was a growing sense of momentum. Not a clear or visible force, but something atmospheric, like pressure building beneath the surface of a landscape. It could not yet be identified as danger. It existed instead as imbalance, as a collection of decisions, beliefs, and movements that had not yet revealed their final shape. Los Angeles, in this moment, was not aware that it was approaching a threshold. It still believed in its own separation between fiction and reality, between performance and consequence. But within certain isolated spaces, that separation was already beginning to dissolve. And in that dissolution, the conditions were being formed for events that would soon force the city to recognize that some narratives are not written by culture or time, but by the collision of belief and action in places where no one is looking closely enough to stop them. Sharon Tate was not remembered, at least in the beginning, as a symbol of tragedy. She was remembered as light. There are people who seem to enter a room and immediately alter its temperature, not through force or attention-seeking, but through presence alone. Sharon Tate was one of those people. Those who knew her often described a softness in the way she moved through life, as if she was always slightly aware of the fragility of the moment she was inside. She was not someone who demanded space. She simply occupied it in a way that made others feel temporarily more at ease with their own existence. Born in Dallas, Texas, she had moved frequently during her childhood due to her father's military career. That early life of constant relocation gave her a sense of impermanence that would follow her into adulthood. She learned early how to observe people quickly, how to adapt to unfamiliar environments, how to find stability in temporary connections. These skills would later serve her in an industry that demanded constant reinvention. By the time she arrived in Hollywood, she was already accustomed to the idea that identity could be flexible. The film industry in the 1960s was still a place where beauty could open doors, but it was also a place that required resilience to survive. Sharon Tate possessed both. She was not immediately positioned as a major star, but she had a presence that cameras seemed to understand instinctively. There was something cinematic about her even when she was not acting, as if she had been framed by light even in ordinary moments. Her early roles were small, often defined by her appearance more than her depth as an actress. But those who worked with her noticed something beyond surface level. She was attentive. She listened more than she spoke. She carried a quiet seriousness beneath her gentle exterior, as if she was aware that she was still learning how to inhabit the world she had entered. In 1966, she met Roman Polanski, a director whose creative intensity matched her own quiet focus in unexpected ways. Their relationship became one of the most visible parts of her life, not because it was designed for public attention, but because both existed within the orbit of an industry that constantly magnified private lives into public narratives. Together, they moved through a world of film sets, premieres, and social gatherings that blended art with celebrity culture. By 1969, Sharon Tate was no longer just an actress working toward recognition. She was pregnant with her first child, living in a rented house on Cielo Drive in the Benedict Canyon area of Los Angeles. The house itself was situated in a place that felt removed from the city below, surrounded by hills that created the illusion of isolation. It was the kind of location that suggested safety, not because it was fortified, but because it felt distant from the chaos of urban life. Inside that house, life was shaped by small, ordinary rhythms. Friends came and went. Conversations stretched late into the night. Meals were shared without urgency. There were books left open on tables, clothing casually placed on chairs, and the subtle anticipation of new life preparing to enter the world. Sharon moved through these spaces with a calm awareness of her condition, often resting, often reading, often simply existing in the quiet progression of days. Those who visited the house during that period often remembered its atmosphere as unusually warm. Not luxurious in a performative sense, but lived in, comfortable, and unguarded. It was a place where people felt temporarily removed from the pressures of the industry and the city itself. That sense of removal would later become one of the most haunting contrasts in the story that followed. Sharon herself was preparing for motherhood with a mixture of excitement and reflection. Friends recalled her speaking about the future with a sense of grounded optimism. She imagined what her child might be like, how life would change, how priorities would shift. There was no indication in her demeanor of anything other than forward movement. She was, in many ways, stepping into one of the most transformative phases of her life. Yet even within that period of calm, there were small fragments of tension that existed outside her awareness. Los Angeles, at that time, was a city in which invisible currents of instability were already forming. The contrast between public optimism and private fragmentation was becoming increasingly pronounced. Sharon's world existed within one layer of the city, while other lives were unfolding in parallel structures that did not intersect with hers directly, but were moving toward collision in ways that could not yet be perceived. On the evening of August 8, 1969, the house on Cielo Drive held several guests. Sharon was not alone. The presence of friends created a sense of shared routine, an ordinary social evening within an extraordinary life. There was no indication that the night would deviate from its expected path. Conversations continued in familiar rhythms. People moved between rooms without awareness of interruption. The house itself, positioned above the city lights, gave the impression that nothing from below could reach it without permission. Sharon, 8 months pregnant, remained largely within the interior spaces of the house. Her movements were slower than usual, dictated by the physical reality of her condition. Yet she remained engaged with those around her, participating in conversation, observing, listening. Those present that night would later struggle to reconcile the normality of those final hours with what would follow. It is often difficult to describe ordinary moments that exist on the edge of irreversible change. The mind tends to separate life into before and after, but in reality, there is no visible boundary between them at the time they occur. On that night, there was no warning, no disruption in the flow of events that could have been interpreted as significant. The house remained what it had always been, a temporary gathering place for people who believed, for that moment, in the continuity of their lives. Sharon's relationships within that space reflected her general approach to life, gentle, attentive, present. She did not dominate conversations. She did not seek control over the atmosphere. Instead, she contributed to it through small gestures, through listening, through the quiet acknowledgement of others' presence. There was a natural ease in the way she interacted with those around her, a quality that made people feel seen without feeling examined. Outside the house, the canyon remained still. The night air moved slowly through the surrounding hills, carrying with it the distant noise of a city that continued to exist without interruption. The contrast between the isolation of the location and the vastness of Los Angeles below created a sense of separation that felt almost protective. It was easy to believe, in such a place, that distance itself could function as safety. For Sharon, that evening represented continuity. It was another step in a life that was expanding toward motherhood, toward stability, toward a future that seemed increasingly defined. There was no indication in her actions, in her words, or in the atmosphere around her that anything had shifted out of alignment. And yet, within the broader context of the city, unseen forces were already converging. Lives that had never intersected were approaching the same moment from entirely different directions. The structure of belief systems, social fragmentation, and psychological isolation in other parts of Los Angeles was creating conditions that had no awareness of the people living in homes like the one on Cielo Drive. Sharon Tate, in that moment, remained unaware of anything beyond the immediate present. She was a woman in her final weeks of pregnancy, surrounded by familiar faces, inside a house that felt removed from danger not because it was defended, but because it felt separate from the world that contained it. That sense of separation would later become one of the most painful illusions in the entire narrative. Because in reality, the boundaries between worlds are never as stable as they appear. And on that night, without any visible signal, those boundaries were already beginning to collapse. The night did not announce what it was becoming. It simply continued, as nights always do, carrying people forward in the illusion that continuity is the same as safety. Inside the house on Cielo Drive, time moved in soft layers. Conversations rose and fell without urgency. Chairs were shifted slightly as people changed rooms. Glasses were placed down and picked up again. The kind of small human choreography that fills ordinary evenings unfolded without interruption, each movement reinforcing the belief that nothing outside could disturb the internal rhythm of the house. Sharon Tate remained within that rhythm. Her pregnancy gave her presence a certain gravity, as if she was already partially anchored in a future that others could only imagine. She moved less than the others, but she remained connected to the flow of the evening, responding when spoken to, smiling when something amused her, listening with the calm attention that those around her had come to recognize as part of her nature. Outside, the property appeared untouched by anything beyond itself. The driveway curved upward through the canyon, bordered by darkness that thickened as it moved away from the faint spill of light near the house. The hedges and trees that surrounded the property did not suggest vulnerability. They suggested privacy, separation, distance from intrusion. From a distance, the house looked like a place that had deliberately removed itself from the world below. But distance is not protection. It only delays contact. At some point in the night, beyond the immediate awareness of those inside, movement began to approach the property. It was not chaotic. It was not loud. It was controlled, deliberate, shaped by a sense of purpose that did not belong to the environment it was entering. The figures who moved through the canyon did so with a kind of practiced silence, as if they had rehearsed the absence of hesitation. They were not strangers to each other. They were bound not only by physical presence, but by shared belief, a structure of thought that had replaced individual judgment. Within that structure, actions were not evaluated in the way they are in ordinary life. They were interpreted, assigned meaning, placed into a narrative that existed before the actions themselves occurred. As they approached the property, the house remained unaware. Lights still glowed in certain rooms. The interior remained warm with human presence. The idea that this space could be penetrated from outside did not exist within the minds of those inside, because it had never needed to exist. Safety, in such environments, is often assumed rather than maintained. The first breach of that assumption did not arrive with noise. It arrived with transition, a change in the boundary between outside and inside that was too subtle at first to register as danger. A gate, a path, a movement from one layer of space into another. Each step carried them closer to a threshold that separated ordinary life from irreversible consequence. Inside, the evening continued. There was a sense of comfort in the house that came from familiarity. The people present had settled into the natural flow of the night. Some conversations had become quieter, others more reflective. There was no tension in the room that could be clearly identified as warning. The human mind is structured to normalize its environment, and so even in spaces that are about to be disrupted, normality persists, until the exact moment it can no longer survive. Sharon Tate, due to her condition, was more stationary than others, but she remained engaged. Her attention moved between people in the room, between fragments of conversation, between moments of silence that felt comfortable rather than heavy. She was not thinking in terms of danger or threat. Her world at that moment was still defined by proximity, by trust, by the assumption that the boundaries of her environment were intact. It is important to understand how fragile such assumptions are. They are not based on constant verification, but on repetition. A house that has always been safe is assumed to remain safe. A neighborhood that has never been violated is assumed to remain untouched. The mind does not continuously test these assumptions, because to do so would be exhausting. Instead, it stores them as background truths. Outside, that background truth was already breaking. The group moving toward the house had passed the point of hesitation. Whatever internal conflicts might have existed earlier had been absorbed into a single directional certainty. In their perception, they were not entering a private home. They were entering a symbolic space. The distinction between physical reality and ideological interpretation had dissolved to the point where consequences no longer held their usual meaning. The house itself, from their perspective, represented something beyond its architecture. It was part of a system they believed they understood, a system they believed was already collapsing. In that interpretation, their movement toward it was not random. It was structured within a narrative that gave them justification, however distorted that justification might appear from outside. At the edge of the property, the transition from external world to internal space became final. The separation that had protected the house until that moment was crossed. What had been distance became proximity. What had been observation became entry. Inside, nothing had yet changed. This is often the most difficult moment to describe in any account of violence, the moment immediately before recognition. Because in that moment, the world is still intact. The people inside are still themselves. Their conversations still belong to the same emotional continuity that existed minutes earlier. There is no visible fracture in experience. And yet, the fracture has already occurred. It simply has not been perceived. When the first disruption finally entered the awareness of the house, it did so in fragments rather than a single event. A shift in attention. A sound that did not belong to the expected environment. A moment of confusion that had not yet resolved into meaning. The human brain attempts to categorize anomalies quickly, to assign them to harmless explanations before escalating them to threat. That process happens almost instantly, and most of the time it is correct. This time, it was not. The presence that entered the house did not conform to the expectations of those inside. It did not behave as a visitor would behave. It did not follow the patterns of social entry that define ordinary human interaction. Instead, it disrupted those patterns entirely, replacing them with actions that could not be integrated into the existing understanding of the situation. The shift from normality to crisis is rarely a single moment. It is a cascade. First confusion, then recognition, then the collapse of explanation, and finally the emergence of fear. Each stage compresses time. Each stage reduces the ability of the mind to maintain coherence. Inside the house, that cascade began. Sharon Tate, along with the others present, experienced the breakdown of expectation in real time. The environment that had been stable seconds earlier became unstable without warning. Attempts to interpret what was happening collided with the impossibility of interpretation. The human mind struggles when confronted with actions that do not belong to any familiar category of experience. In such moments, reality becomes fragmented. Attention narrows. Details become exaggerated while context disappears. A movement, a voice, a direction of force becomes the entire world for the person experiencing it. Outside, the canyon remained unchanged. The night air still moved through the trees. The city below continued its distant rhythm, unaware that one of its elevated spaces had shifted into a completely different state of existence. Inside, that state had fully formed. There was no longer continuity between before and after. Only transition. The kind that cannot be reversed, only survived or not survived. And as the house crossed that threshold, the illusion of separation, that had defined its existence since the beginning of the evening finally collapsed completely. By the time the first light of dawn began to press against the edges of the Los Angeles sky, the house on Cielo Drive had already changed in a way that could not be reversed. From the outside, nothing immediately announced itself. The structure still stood in its place, still framed by the canyon's quiet geometry of trees and slopes. The driveway still curved upward in its familiar path. The windows still reflected fragments of the darkened sky giving way to pale morning. But within that stillness, something had shifted beyond the reach of ordinary observation. The house no longer belonged to the same category of reality it had occupied the night before. The first people to arrive were not prepared for what they would find, even though they had been trained, in theory, for situations that required composure in the presence of tragedy. Experience, however, does not always prepare the human mind for the specific shape of horror it will encounter. There is always a gap between knowledge and confrontation, and that gap becomes most visible in spaces where violence has left behind not just evidence, but atmosphere. As they approached the property, there was an initial sense that something was wrong in a way that could not yet be named. It was not immediately visual. It was environmental. The air itself seemed to hold a different weight, as if the normal expectations of a residential space had been subtly displaced. The silence was not peaceful. It was imposed. The gate was open. That detail, simple and unremarkable in isolation, carried a significance that only became apparent in retrospect. It suggested interruption, entry, departure. It indicated that the boundary between private space and external world had been crossed in a way that was not part of any ordinary sequence of events. Still, at that moment, it was only a detail, not yet a conclusion. The driveway led upward as it always had. The house remained visible at the top of the incline, its structure unchanged in form, but altered in meaning. As the first responders moved closer, their attention began to shift from expectation to recognition that something within this environment required a different interpretive framework. The front of the house showed no obvious signs of forced entry in the way one might expect from a burglary or intrusion. There was no immediate visual chaos from the exterior perspective. This absence of clear indicators made the situation more difficult to process, not easier. The human mind relies heavily on recognizable patterns when interpreting distress. When those patterns are absent or incomplete, comprehension slows. It was only upon entering that the true nature of the situation began to unfold. Inside, the house no longer functioned as a domestic space. The arrangement of rooms, furniture, and personal belongings remained physically present, but their meaning had been overwritten by events that had occurred within them. The normal associations that define a home had been replaced by something that resisted categorization. Every object seemed to carry the weight of interruption. The initial room they entered held evidence of a struggle that could not be mistaken for anything else. The signs were not abstract. They were direct, immediate, and physically undeniable. The environment had been disrupted in a way that suggested urgency, resistance, and overwhelming force. Yet even this description feels insufficient when attempting to translate the sensory reality of such a space into language. What made the scene particularly difficult for those encountering it was not only the presence of violence, but the absence of order that typically accompanies it in investigative understanding. There are moments in criminal investigation where chaos can still be reconstructed into sequence. Here, the sequence itself felt fractured. As they moved further into the house, the realization began to form that multiple lives had been affected in a manner that extended beyond isolated incident. The space contained more than one point of impact, more than one center of trauma. This multiplicity altered the entire structure of interpretation. It was no longer a single event that needed to be understood, but a series of interconnected actions that had unfolded within a confined environment over a short period of time. The emotional response of those present was not immediate in the expressive sense. Training and professional discipline often delay emotional processing. But beneath that surface control, there was an unmistakable internal shift. The kind that occurs when expectation is replaced by recognition of scale. The house was no longer being assessed as a site of disturbance. It was being understood as a site of extreme violence. In one of the rooms, the presence of individuals who had been inside during the night became evident. Their positions, their condition, and the surrounding environment created a picture that would later be reconstructed in detail, but in that moment existed only as immediate sensory information. The human mind does not initially process such scenes as narrative. It processes them as overload. There were signs that indicated the events had unfolded over time rather than in a single instant. This temporal dimension added complexity to the understanding of what had occurred. It suggested progression, escalation, and sequence. The space itself seemed to hold echoes of movement, as if different stages of the night had left behind traces that overlapped without fully resolving into a coherent timeline. As investigators moved through the house, they encountered additional rooms where similar evidence was present. Each space contributed another fragment to the emerging understanding, but none of them provided a complete picture on their own. Instead, they formed a fragmented architecture of events that had to be reconstructed through careful analysis. The emotional weight of the scene extended beyond professional obligation. Even those trained to maintain distance from their subject matter experienced moments of internal disruption. There is a point at which observation becomes recognition of human presence, and at that point, detachment becomes difficult to sustain. The reality that lives had been present in this space only hours earlier, and were no longer present in the same way, created a dissonance that could not be easily resolved. Outside the house, the morning continued its progression. The canyon gradually filled with light. Birds moved through the air with indifference to human events. The natural world did not pause to interpret what had occurred within the structure it surrounded. This contrast between internal catastrophe and external continuity is one of the most defining aspects of such scenes. Life continues in parallel layers that do not always acknowledge each other. As more personnel arrived, the scale of the situation became clearer. Communication between those inside the house and those outside began to form a structured understanding of the scope of what had occurred. The initial uncertainty gave way to confirmation, though confirmation, in such contexts, does not bring clarity so much as it brings permanence. The house itself became a focal point not only of investigation, but of collective attention. Every detail, every surface, every object had to be considered within a new framework. Nothing could be interpreted casually. Everything required contextualization within the unfolding reconstruction of events. What made the situation particularly difficult was the realization that the individuals involved were not unknown within their social sphere. The recognition of identity transformed the investigation from abstract crime scene into something more personally and culturally significant. The distance between observer and subject collapsed further with each new piece of information. As morning fully arrived, the house stood in a state that was no longer aligned with its original purpose. It had ceased to function as a private residence in any meaningful sense. It had become instead a point of convergence between private life, public attention, and investigative necessity. And yet, even in this early stage of understanding, one fact remained unresolved. The sequence of events that had led to this outcome was still incomplete. The house could reveal what had happened within it, but it could not yet explain why those events had been set in motion, or how the people responsible had arrived at the point where such actions became possible. That explanation would require a different kind of investigation, one that extended beyond physical space into networks of belief, influence, and psychological transformation. For now, however, the only certainty was what remained visible within the house itself, the aftermath of a night that had ended not in silence alone, but in a rupture that would soon extend far beyond the walls where it occurred. In the hours after the initial discovery on Cielo Drive, Los Angeles law enforcement found itself facing a kind of case that did not immediately behave like a case at all. There are investigations that begin with clarity, where evidence points in a direction that, while complex, still follows recognizable logic. Then there are investigations that begin with fragmentation, where each new piece of information introduces more uncertainty than resolution. This was the latter. Not because there was no evidence, but because the evidence refused to align itself into a coherent narrative. At first, the assumption was that the incident might be isolated. The idea of a targeted intrusion was considered. So was the possibility of a burglary gone wrong. In many urban investigations, initial hypotheses often lean toward practical explanations, even when the scene itself resists simplicity. The human mind, even trained minds, prefers order. It seeks familiar categories to contain what it does not yet understand. But as additional details emerged, that sense of containment began to collapse. The nature of the scene did not match the expected profile of a conventional break-in or spontaneous act of violence. There were elements that suggested planning, yet the execution did not align with financial motive or personal dispute. There were also indications that multiple individuals had been involved, which immediately expanded the scope of the investigation beyond a single suspect framework. As detectives began reconstructing the timeline, another complication emerged. The individuals who had been present during the incident were not in a position to provide immediate, clear testimony in a unified form. Information came in fragments, often emotionally charged, sometimes inconsistent, and always shaped by trauma. In such conditions, memory itself becomes unstable. The mind does not record events like a camera. It reconstructs them, and under extreme stress, that reconstruction becomes fragmented. Within this uncertainty, investigators began to map connections outward from the scene itself. The house on Cielo Drive was not an isolated node. It was part of a broader social environment connected to Hollywood, entertainment circles, and informal networks of acquaintances. Early inquiries focused on identifying visitors, acquaintances, and any recent interactions that might provide context for why this location had been targeted. At this stage, however, there was no clear indication that the motive was rooted in personal grievance. Nothing suggested a direct conflict between the victims and any known individuals who might be immediately responsible. This absence of a recognizable link made the case more difficult to categorize. While one part of the investigation remained focused on reconstructing the events inside the house, another began to expand outward into the surrounding social environment of Los Angeles. It was here that a different pattern began to emerge, one that initially seemed unrelated, but gradually revealed points of intersection that could not be ignored. Reports began to surface regarding a loosely connected group of young individuals who had been moving through various locations in and around Los Angeles. They were not initially considered central to the investigation. At first glance, they appeared to be part of the broader countercultural movement that defined California during that period. Many such groups existed, and most were nonviolent communities formed around shared ideals of rejection of conventional society. However, as interviews progressed and unrelated reports were compared, a more specific pattern began to take shape. Certain individuals appeared repeatedly in different contexts. Their names surfaced in conversations with people who had hosted transient visitors. Their presence was noted in rural properties, communal living spaces, and informal gatherings that existed on the fringes of mainstream society. Among these names was a figure who would soon become central to the entire investigation, Charles Manson. At first, his name did not carry the weight it would later acquire. He was initially one among many individuals connected to transient communities. But as investigators followed these threads, a more complex picture began to emerge. Manson was not simply a participant in a broader cultural movement. He appeared to occupy a position of influence within a smaller, more tightly structured group. This group, later referred to as the Manson family, operated in a way that did not conform to traditional social organization. It was not a commune in the conventional sense, nor was it a formally recognized organization. It existed in a fluid state, defined more by interpersonal dynamics than by structure. As law enforcement began to examine this group more closely, testimonies from individuals associated with it revealed a pattern of psychological dependence. Members described a lifestyle in which decision-making was increasingly centralized around Manson himself. His influence was not maintained through physical coercion alone, but through a combination of emotional manipulation, ideological framing, and the gradual erosion of external reference points. One of the most significant challenges for investigators was understanding how such influence could translate into coordinated action. The transition from belief to behavior is not always linear. In this case, it appeared to have been facilitated by a system of reinforcement in which abstract ideas about society, collapse, and meaning were repeatedly reinterpreted until they became operational directives. At this stage of the investigation, a critical breakthrough emerged through the interrogation of individuals who had been directly or indirectly involved with the group. Their accounts varied in detail, but a consistent theme began to appear. The events of the night on Cielo Drive were not isolated in intention. They were connected to a broader framework of belief that had been constructed over time. This framework included a distorted interpretation of social conflict, apocalyptic thinking, and the belief that violence could function as a catalyst for larger societal transformation. Within this belief system, actions that would normally be considered incomprehensible were reframed as purposeful. As these narratives were analyzed, investigators began to see that the challenge was not only to identify who had committed the acts, but to understand how a group of individuals could be led to perceive such actions as meaningful. This realization marked a shift in the investigation. It was no longer solely about physical evidence or immediate suspects. It had expanded into the domain of psychological conditioning and group dynamics. Surveillance, interviews, and background checks began to converge on Spahn Ranch, a location that had become one of the primary gathering points for members of the group. The ranch itself, located in a remote area, provided both physical isolation and social separation. It allowed the group to exist with minimal external interference, reinforcing internal cohesion. When authorities eventually moved to detain individuals associated with the group, the transition from observation to direct confrontation revealed additional layers of complexity. Some members displayed confusion, others exhibited detachment from the severity of the situation, and a few appeared to interpret the intervention through the same ideological framework that had guided their previous actions. Charles Manson himself was not immediately presented as the sole physical executor of the violence. Instead, his role was gradually constructed through cumulative testimony, behavioral analysis, and the aggregation of multiple accounts. What emerged was a portrait of influence that did not rely on direct physical presence at every stage, but on sustained psychological direction over time. As the investigation continued to develop, the initial fragmentation of the case began to give way to a more structured understanding. The events on Cielo Drive were no longer viewed as an isolated incident. They were increasingly interpreted as part of a sequence of actions influenced by a shared ideological system that had been cultivated over months. This system did not require formal hierarchy to function. It operated through belief, repetition, and isolation. It created conditions in which individual moral judgment was gradually replaced by group-defined interpretation. By the time sufficient evidence had been gathered to form a coherent prosecutorial narrative, the investigation had already transformed into something larger than its original scope. It was no longer solely about a crime scene in Los Angeles. It had become an examination of how belief systems can evolve into mechanisms of action, and how individuals within those systems can become detached from the moral frameworks that typically govern human behavior. The breakthrough, when it fully arrived, was not a single moment but a convergence. A collection of testimonies, physical evidence, and behavioral patterns that, when assembled, revealed a structure that had previously been invisible. And within that structure, the events of August the 8th and 9th were no longer anomalies. They were consequences. The investigation into the Cielo Drive murders reached a turning point not through a single dramatic revelation, but through the slow accumulation of contradictions that could no longer be ignored. For weeks, law enforcement had been working with fragments of testimony, partial identifications, and behavioral patterns that refused to settle into a stable narrative. Each new interview added detail, but also added complexity. Each new connection widened the perimeter of the case rather than narrowing it. It was as if the investigation itself was circling something that remained partially hidden, visible only through its effects rather than its center. What changed was not the presence of evidence, but the way that evidence began to align. Several individuals connected to the broader social network surrounding the case began to provide information that, while initially inconsistent in tone, revealed overlapping structures of experience. Names repeated across different testimonies. Locations appeared in unrelated accounts. Behavioral descriptions began to converge on a small group operating within a larger, loosely defined countercultural environment. At first, these connections were treated cautiously. In any complex investigation, the risk of pattern recognition bias is significant. Investigators are trained to avoid forcing coherence where none exists. But in this case, the recurrence of specific details across independent sources began to exceed the threshold of coincidence. The focus gradually shifted toward a group of individuals who had been living at Spahn Ranch, a remote property that had functioned as a temporary residence for a number of transient communities over the years. At the time, the ranch was not unusual in appearance. It was a decaying structure on the edge of urban expansion, partially abandoned, partially inhabited, existing in a state of gradual dissolution. But within that environment, a closed social system had formed. When investigators began to examine the ranch more closely, they encountered a pattern of organization that did not resemble traditional communal living. There was no formal leadership structure visible in the conventional sense, yet there was a clear center of influence. Decisions, movements, and behavioral norms within the group appeared to orbit around a single figure, Charles Manson. What made this influence difficult to categorize was its indirect nature. Witnesses did not describe explicit commands in the way one might expect from hierarchical criminal organizations. Instead, they described a more diffuse form of direction. Ideas were introduced gradually, repeated across different conversations, reinforced through shared interpretation of external events, and embedded within a broader philosophical framework that distorted conventional moral boundaries. As this framework was reconstructed, investigators began to recognize that the group's belief system was not static. It evolved over time, incorporating elements of music, cultural commentary, and selective interpretations of social conflict. Within this evolving structure, external reality was continuously reinterpreted to match internal expectations. This process created a self-reinforcing cycle. Events in the outside world were not evaluated independently. Instead, they were filtered through a narrative that assigned them symbolic meaning. In such an environment, contradiction from external sources lost its corrective power. The group's internal logic became self-sustaining. As pressure on the investigation increased, law enforcement began to focus on isolating individuals who could provide direct testimony about the events of August the 8th and 9th. Among those eventually questioned were several members of the group who had been present during critical periods leading up to the murders. Their accounts varied in emotional tone and level of detail, but certain structural consistencies emerged. The events of those nights were not described as spontaneous acts, but as actions that had been preceded by extended ideological preparation. Instructions, when they were given, were often framed within symbolic language rather than direct criminal intent. This made interpretation complex, as participants did not always perceive their actions through the same moral categories that outside observers would apply. One of the most significant challenges for investigators was reconstructing intent. In conventional criminal cases, intent is often inferred from planning, motive, and execution. In this case, intent was distributed across a network of beliefs and influences that had developed over time. It was not always located in a single decision point, but embedded within a gradual transformation of perception. As interrogations continued, the role of Charles Manson became increasingly central. He was not physically present at all of the crime scenes, yet his presence was consistently referenced in the testimonies of those involved. This presence was not described in operational terms alone, but in interpretive terms. He functioned as a source of meaning within the group's internal structure. Investigators began to understand that his influence operated less through direct instruction and more through the shaping of interpretive frameworks. By controlling how events were understood, he effectively influenced how actions were justified. This distinction became critical in building the broader case. At Spahn Ranch, additional evidence of group dynamics emerged. The environment itself reflected a gradual detachment from external reality. Daily routines were irregular, social boundaries were fluid, and the distinction between symbolic interpretation and lived experience was increasingly blurred. Within this setting, authority did not require formal enforcement. It was maintained through shared belief and emotional dependency. Individuals within the group often described a sense of belonging that was inseparable from a sense of direction. Over time, that direction became increasingly aligned with Manson's interpretation of societal collapse. As investigators mapped these relationships, a clearer picture of the internal structure of the group began to emerge. It was not a conventional organization with rigid hierarchy, but a network of influence in which one central figure maintained coherence through narrative control. This structure made external intervention difficult, as there were no formal entry points of authority to dismantle. The breakthrough came when multiple strands of testimony converged around a consistent sequence of events linking the group to the nights of the murders. While individual accounts varied in detail, the overarching pattern became difficult to dismiss. The actions taken on those nights were not isolated expressions of violence, but were connected to a broader ideological system that had been cultivated over an extended period. As this realization took hold, the investigation shifted from identification of perpetrators to reconstruction of psychological process. The central question was no longer only who committed the acts, but how those acts had been made possible within the cognitive and social environment of the group. This shift required a different kind of analysis. Physical evidence could establish presence and sequence, but it could not fully explain transformation. For that, investigators had to rely on behavioral reconstruction, testimonial comparison, and psychological interpretation. Gradually, a coherent narrative began to form. It described a progression from social fragmentation to ideological consolidation, from shared disaffection to structured belief, and from belief to action. Within this progression, the role of Manson was defined not only as a participant, but as an architect of meaning. The breakthrough, therefore, was not a single revelation, but the collapse of ambiguity. The fragments of information that had previously resisted alignment began to form a structured understanding of how the group operated, how influence was maintained, and how actions that once seemed disconnected were part of a continuous process. By the time this structure was fully recognized, the investigation had moved beyond the boundaries of conventional criminal inquiry. It had become an examination of how belief systems can evolve into behavioral frameworks, and how individuals can become agents within systems that redefine their perception of reality itself. And within that understanding, the events of Cielo Drive were no longer seen as isolated tragedy, but as the endpoint of a process that had been unfolding long before the night itself ever began. By the time the trial began, the atmosphere surrounding the case had already moved far beyond the boundaries of a typical criminal proceeding. What was being examined in the courtroom was not only a series of violent acts, but an entire system of belief, influence, and psychological transformation that had unfolded in the shadows of Los Angeles during the previous year. The courtroom became a space where two different interpretations of reality collided. One was grounded in legal structure, evidence, and chronology. The other was rooted in narratives shaped by ideology, symbolism, and distorted perception. Charles Manson, who had already become the central figure in the public imagination of the case, entered the courtroom with an appearance that immediately disrupted expectations. He was not physically imposing in the traditional sense, yet his presence carried an intensity that drew attention not through force, but through unpredictability. At times, he appeared detached from the proceedings, observing with a calmness that seemed almost disconnected from the gravity of the charges. At other moments, he became visibly reactive, responding to testimony in ways that suggested a refusal to accept the authority of the court as a legitimate framework for truth. The courtroom itself became a stage for competing narratives. On one side stood the prosecution, tasked with constructing a coherent account of events based on physical evidence, witness testimony, and investigative reconstruction. On the other side stood the defense, challenging not only the interpretation of evidence, but the very structure through which responsibility was being assigned. One of the central challenges of the trial was establishing the relationship between Manson and the individuals who carried out the murders. Unlike cases in which direct physical evidence links a defendant to a crime scene, this case required the court to examine influence, suggestion, and psychological control. The prosecution argued that Manson had orchestrated the events through a system of manipulation that extended over time, shaping the beliefs and actions of his followers in ways that ultimately led to the murders. Witness testimony played a critical role in this construction. Several members of the group provided detailed accounts of life within the Manson family, describing an environment in which isolation from external society was reinforced, and where Manson's interpretations of reality became the dominant framework through which all events were understood. These testimonies described a gradual process rather than a single moment of coercion. Influence was not always exerted through explicit commands, but through repeated reinforcement of ideas that redefined moral boundaries and social norms. Within the courtroom, these descriptions created a complex evidentiary landscape. The legal system is designed primarily to evaluate actions and intent within conventional frameworks of responsibility. However, this case required the court to consider how intent can be shaped by sustained psychological influence over time. This raised difficult questions about autonomy, responsibility, and the limits of individual agency within systems of ideological control. As testimony continued, the emotional weight of the proceedings became increasingly apparent. Survivors and individuals connected to the victims provided accounts that brought the human impact of the events into sharp focus. Their statements were not only descriptions of loss, but reflections on the sudden disruption of lives that had previously existed in ordinary rhythms. The contrast between those ordinary rhythms and the violence that interrupted them created a persistent tension throughout the trial. The prosecution's strategy focused on demonstrating that the murders were not random acts, but part of a broader pattern of behavior influenced by a coherent internal belief system within the group. This required presenting evidence that extended beyond the immediate crime scenes, incorporating behavioral patterns, prior statements made by members of the group, and the ideological framework that had been developed over time. As the trial progressed, the figure of Manson himself became a focal point of interpretation. His behavior in court, his responses to testimony, and his interactions with legal proceedings were all examined not only as personal reactions, but as potential reflections of the broader psychological dynamics at play. At times, his conduct appeared to challenge the authority of the court directly, reinforcing the perception that he did not fully accept the legitimacy of the external legal system. However, the trial was not only about Manson as an individual. It was also about the individuals who carried out the physical acts of violence. Their testimonies revealed varying degrees of participation, understanding, and retrospective reflection. Some described their actions as the result of influence that had accumulated over time. Others expressed confusion when attempting to reconcile their past beliefs with the legal and moral frameworks presented in court. This divergence of perspective created a layered narrative within the proceedings. Responsibility was not presented as a simple binary between command and execution. Instead, it emerged as a distributed process shaped by environment, belief, and interpersonal dynamics. The court was required to navigate these layers while maintaining the structural requirements of legal judgment. Outside the courtroom, public attention intensified. Media coverage transformed the trial into a national event, with widespread discussion about the nature of the crimes and the individuals involved. The case became a reference point for broader cultural anxieties about social fragmentation, youth counterculture, and the potential for ideological extremism to manifest in physical violence. Within this public discourse, interpretations of the case varied widely. Some viewed it as an isolated incident involving a small, aberrant group. Others interpreted it as a symptom of deeper societal instability. The trial thus existed simultaneously, as a legal proceeding and as a cultural lens through which broader questions about society were being examined. Inside the courtroom, however, the focus remained on establishing accountability within the framework of law. The prosecution systematically presented evidence linking Manson to the orchestration of the events, emphasizing the continuity between ideological influence and physical action. The defense challenged these interpretations, questioning the reliability of testimony and the extent to which influence could be equated with direct responsibility. Throughout the proceedings, the emotional intensity of the case remained constant. The courtroom was not simply a place of legal analysis, but a space in which the consequences of past actions were continuously made present through testimony, evidence, and reconstruction of events. Each day of the trial reinforced the reality that what was being examined extended beyond abstract legal principles into deeply human experiences of loss, influence, and accountability. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, the structure of the case had become increasingly defined. The narrative presented by the prosecution had coalesced into a coherent argument that positioned Manson as the central figure in a system of influence that led to the murders. The defense's efforts to fragment this narrative were ultimately unable to dismantle the broader pattern established through cumulative evidence and testimony. When the verdict was finally delivered, it represented not only the conclusion of a legal process, but the formal recognition of a structure of responsibility that had been constructed over the course of the trial. Charles Manson was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment, along with several of his followers who had participated directly in the murders. In that moment, the courtroom shifted from a space of contested interpretation to one of final judgment. Yet even as the legal process reached its conclusion, the broader questions raised by the case remained unresolved. The trial had established accountability within the framework of law, but it had also revealed the complexity of influence, belief, and psychological transformation in ways that extended beyond legal categorization. The proceedings ended, but the questions they raised continued to resonate. After the verdict was delivered and the courtroom emptied of its immediate function, what remained was not closure in any emotional sense, but a slow settling of consequences into public consciousness. The case had already stopped being just a legal matter by the time the trial concluded. It had become something larger and more persistent, something that continued to exist outside the boundaries of court transcripts and sentencing documents. In Los Angeles, the hills where the events had taken place no longer felt neutral. Spaces that had once been associated with privacy and distance were now layered with memory, and that memory did not fade in the way ordinary news cycles fade. For those directly connected to the victims, life after the trial did not follow the narrative arc that public attention often assumes. There was no moment where grief ended or transformed into resolution. Instead, there was continuation. A different kind of existence built around absence. The house on Cielo Drive, even after it was no longer treated as an active crime scene, remained a reference point that could not be removed from personal histories. Physical spaces have a way of holding meaning even when their occupants are gone. In the broader cultural landscape, the case began to shift from immediate horror into something more reflective. People were no longer only asking what had happened, but why it had been possible at all. That question expanded outward, touching subjects far beyond the courtroom: social fragmentation, youth disillusionment, the collapse of trust in traditional authority structures, and the psychological vulnerability that can emerge in transitional cultural periods. Charles Manson himself, now confined within the prison system, remained a figure of continued public fascination. Not because of physical presence, but because of what he had come to represent in collective imagination. He was no longer only an individual. He had become a symbol through which people attempted to understand how influence can distort perception, and how belief systems can evolve into frameworks that detach individuals from conventional moral reference points. Inside the prison environment, his life continued in a state far removed from the world that had once surrounded him. The energy that had once drawn others into his orbit no longer functioned in the same way within institutional confinement. Yet his name remained active in public discourse, appearing in discussions, documentaries, and cultural analyses that sought to interpret the events of 1969 through evolving psychological and sociological perspectives. The members of the group, who had been sentenced alongside him, also entered lives defined by incarceration. Over time, their identities became increasingly shaped by the legal outcome of the case rather than by the internal dynamics that had once defined their existence within the group. The passage of time within prison has a way of flattening earlier identities, reducing complex personal histories into simplified categories of conviction and sentence. Outside the prison system, Los Angeles itself continued to evolve. The physical spaces associated with the case underwent changes. Houses were sold, demolished, rebuilt, or repurposed. But even when architecture changed, perception often did not follow at the same pace. Certain locations remained marked by association, even when no visible trace of the original events remained. Memory, once attached to a place, does not require physical confirmation to persist. In cultural terms, the case contributed to a shift in how society viewed the intersection between counterculture movements and violent extremism. The optimism that had characterized parts of the 1960s began to give way to a more cautious and fragmented cultural outlook in the years that followed. The idea that alternative communities were inherently safe or benign was replaced by a more complex understanding that isolation, ideology, and psychological influence could interact in unpredictable ways. This shift was not immediate. It unfolded gradually, shaped by media representation, academic analysis, and public reflection. The case became a reference point in discussions about group psychology, influence dynamics, and the conditions under which individuals can become detached from broader societal norms. It was studied not only as a criminal case, but as a psychological and sociological phenomenon. For the families of the victims, however, these broader interpretations existed in parallel to a more personal reality that did not conform to analytical frameworks. Grief, in its most direct form, does not evolve into theory. It remains anchored in absence. The individuals who were lost in the events of August 1969 continued to exist in memory, in photographs, in conversations that could no longer include their voices. The passage of time does not replace presence. It only changes the way absence is experienced. One of the most difficult aspects of the aftermath was the way public attention sometimes intersected with private mourning. High-profile cases attract sustained interest, and that attention can create a secondary layer of experience for those most closely affected. The need to maintain privacy, while being constantly referenced in public discourse, added complexity to an already difficult process of adjustment. At the same time, the case continued to influence legal and psychological discussions about responsibility and influence. The trial had introduced difficult questions about the boundaries between personal autonomy and external psychological control. These questions did not receive simple answers. Instead, they became part of ongoing academic and legal debates that extended far beyond the specifics of the case itself. In retrospective analysis, the events were often framed as a convergence of multiple factors rather than a single causal chain. Social instability, individual vulnerability, charismatic influence, and ideological distortion were all examined as contributing elements. This multilayered interpretation reflected an increasing recognition that human behavior, particularly in extreme cases, rarely emerges from a single source. As years passed, the case became embedded in cultural memory not only as a story of violence, but as a warning about the complexity of belief systems and the fragility of psychological boundaries. It was referenced in studies of group dynamics, in discussions about radicalization, and in broader reflections on how meaning can be constructed and distorted within closed environments. Yet even as analytical frameworks expanded, the core reality of the events remained resistant to full comprehension. There is always a limit to how completely human actions can be explained once they have crossed certain thresholds. Beyond that point, explanation becomes interpretation, and interpretation becomes shaped by the perspectives of those attempting to understand. The legacy of the Manson family murders, therefore, does not exist in a single domain. It exists simultaneously in legal history, cultural memory, psychological study, and personal grief. Each of these domains holds a different version of the same events, none of which fully contains the others. In the end, what remains most persistent is not only the memory of what occurred, but the awareness that ordinary environments can, under specific conditions, transform into spaces where familiar assumptions no longer apply. That realization continued to influence how society thought about trust, proximity, and the invisible structures that shape human behavior. And long after the legal system had completed its function, the events continued to exist as a reminder that beneath the surface of everyday life, the boundary between belief and action is sometimes thinner than it appears, and once crossed, it cannot easily be restored. Long after the courtroom lights dimmed and the case was officially closed in the eyes of the law, the story of the Manson family continued to evolve in a different space, one that was less about facts and more about interpretation. In the years following the trial, public understanding of the events did not settle into a single narrative. Instead, it fractured into multiple layers of meaning, each reflecting the anxieties and questions of the time in which it was being retold. For some, the case became a symbol of the end of an era, the collapse of the idealistic vision associated with the late 1960s. For others, it became an example of how fragile human perception can be when confronted with persuasive influence and isolation. The figure of Charles Manson remained central in almost every retelling, but his role in public memory shifted subtly over time. In the immediate aftermath, he was viewed primarily through the lens of criminal responsibility. As years passed, that image expanded into something more complex, incorporating psychological, cultural, and even philosophical interpretations. He became less a person in the public imagination, and more a representation of a question that could not be easily resolved. How does influence become action, and where does responsibility truly begin? Within prison walls, Manson's physical life became static, defined by routine, confinement, and institutional structure. Yet his symbolic presence outside those walls remained unusually active. Interviews, documentaries, and media representations continued to revisit his statements, behavior, and the mythology that had formed around him. Over time, this created a paradoxical situation, in which his influence in public discourse seemed to persist even as his direct ability to act in the world had been completely removed. This paradox became a subject of interest not only for journalists, but also for psychologists and sociologists who studied the case. They examined how individuals, who once existed within tightly controlled group environments, often continue to be interpreted through the lens of that control long after the group itself has dissolved. The Manson family became an early and enduring example of how collective belief systems can be studied as psychological structures, rather than simply criminal organizations. In academic discussions, the case was frequently analyzed in relation to concepts such as group identity, obedience, and the erosion of individual autonomy under sustained ideological pressure. Researchers explored how isolation from external reference points can gradually reshape perception, leading individuals to accept interpretations of reality that would otherwise seem incompatible with broader social norms. At the same time, cultural representations of the case began to multiply. Books, films, and television programs revisited the events from different perspectives, each attempting to bring clarity to aspects that remained inherently resistant to full explanation. Some focused on the psychological dimensions of Manson's influence. Others concentrated on the lives of the victims, attempting to restore individuality and humanity to those who had been reduced to names within legal proceedings and media headlines. This dual focus reflected a broader tension in how society processes extreme events. On one hand, there is a desire to understand the mechanisms behind such events in order to prevent their recurrence. On the other hand, there is a need to acknowledge the irreducible human cost that resists abstraction. The Manson case existed at the intersection of these two impulses, never fully satisfying either. As cultural memory continued to evolve, the physical locations associated with the case also underwent transformation. The house on Cielo Drive, once central to the events, eventually ceased to exist in its original form. It was demolished and rebuilt, its physical structure replaced by something new. Yet the symbolic weight of the location did not disappear with its reconstruction. In collective memory, the address remained tied to a specific moment in time, regardless of physical change. This phenomenon highlighted an important aspect of how memory functions in relation to place. Physical spaces are often treated as containers of meaning, but that meaning is not dependent on continuity of structure. It is carried by narrative, repetition, and cultural reinforcement. Even when the physical environment changes completely, the narrative associated with it can remain stable across generations. Within law enforcement and criminal psychology, the case continued to be referenced in discussions about behavioral influence and group dynamics. It became part of training materials, case studies, and academic frameworks used to understand how individuals can become embedded within belief systems that alter their perception of morality and consequence. These discussions often emphasized that the most significant aspect of the case was not only the violence itself, but the process by which that violence became possible within a structured social environment. One of the recurring themes in these analyses was the role of isolation. The Manson family did not operate in complete isolation from society, but it maintained enough separation to allow internal narratives to develop without consistent external correction. This partial isolation created a feedback loop in which internal beliefs were reinforced by group consensus rather than tested against external reality. Another key theme was reinterpretation. External events were continuously reframed to fit the internal belief system of the group. This process gradually reduced the influence of contradictory information, allowing internal narratives to become increasingly self-contained. Over time, this contributed to a perception of reality that diverged significantly from the broader social environment. These mechanisms, while extreme in this case, became subjects of broader interest, because they illustrated patterns that could, under different circumstances, appear in less extreme forms within other group settings. The case therefore extended beyond its immediate context, serving as a reference point for understanding how influence and belief can interact under specific conditions. Despite extensive analysis, however, there remained elements of the case that resisted full conceptual closure. The transition from belief to action, particularly in relation to the events of August 1969, continued to be examined, but never fully resolved into a singular explanatory model. This unresolved dimension contributed to the enduring fascination with the case, both in academic and public discourse. For those who lived through the period, the case also functioned as a marker of cultural transition. The optimism and experimentation of the late 1960s gave way, in part, to a more cautious and fragmented cultural atmosphere in the years that followed. This shift was not solely caused by the events of the Manson family, but the case became one of the defining reference points through which that shift was understood. In personal terms, the passage of time did not diminish the significance of the events for those directly affected. Instead, it altered the way that significance was experienced. Memory, in such contexts, does not fade but reorganizes itself. It becomes integrated into life in ways that change its form without reducing its presence. As decades passed, the case continued to be revisited, reinterpreted, and recontextualized. Each generation encountered it through different cultural lenses, bringing new questions to events that remained fundamentally unchanged. In this way, the story of the Manson family did not remain fixed in the past. It continued to exist as a living reference point within cultural memory. And within that ongoing presence, the central tension of the case remained unresolved: the relationship between influence and responsibility, between belief and action, and between the human desire for meaning and the consequences that can arise when meaning becomes detached from reality. That tension, more than any single event or individual, is what continues to define the legacy of the case.